So in the first exam, we would have covered sort of the basics of muscle phys. We would have talked about the, um, the structure of muscle. We would have talked about the cross-bridge cycle. We would have talked about excitation, contraction, coupling, and kind of the basics of muscle physiology. What we're going to pick up now with and look at is the physiology itself. So the physiologic aspects of how muscles work, how those contractions. So we spent quite a bit of time talking about how those contractions come to be with the role of calcium regulating that. We talked about excitation, contraction, coupling. So how that contraction is regulated, in other words, turned on and off. What we're going to speak about now is force generation. How do those contractions lead to muscles generating force, right? Force to do work. So we'll speak about the twitch. We'll talk about factors that affect how much force an individual muscle fiber can generate. Then we'll talk about the regulation of force generation. And then at the very end, we'll speak about the velocity of shortening, how quick that muscle can contract. So let's start here by introducing this idea called the twitch. And the twitch is a brief period of a single muscle contraction. It's a contraction that's produced by a muscle fiber in response to a single action potential. So it's kind of the unit of muscle contraction, if you will. It is an all or nothing event for a muscle fiber that is resting. It can be defined for a single fiber. We can talk about a twitch as it applies to an entire motor unit, or we could think about a twitch at the level of the entire muscle, right? But it's just that brief period of a single contraction that is caused by a single action potential. All right, in other words, a single unit of muscle contraction. Now, if we were to look at a single twitch, there are different phases of a twitch. There's the latent period, there is the contraction phase, and then there is the relaxation phase. Now, we'll talk about what each phase, what's happening in each phase in terms of the biochemistry, what's going on inside the muscle fiber and along the sarcomeres that is resulting in these different phases. So the latent period is where the contraction hasn't really begun yet. This is the time that it takes from the action potential, arriving at the muscle, running through those T tubules, signaling through the ryanodine and the DHP receptors, the opening up of the channels on the SR, that calcium leaving the SR, going into the sarcoplasm, binding onto that troponin and sliding those fibers so that the binding sites for myosin are exposed. So all of that takes time, right? That takes some time between the action potential arriving at the muscle and that excitation, contraction, coupling process. And then we can see the sarcomeres, right? The cross-bridge cycling. That is what's happening in the latent period. And so if we were to look at the graph here, which is showing the amount of force or tension produced by a muscle in grams, and compare that to the time it takes, right? These phases occurring in different time periods, we would see that the latent period, there is zero force generation. Because contraction hasn't started yet, because the machinery is just getting warmed up, the force generation is still zero, and then we'll see that force begins to be generated in the next phase. So the next phase is the contraction phase. This is where we now have the machinery warmed up, calcium is in the sarcoplasm, it's done its thing, it's bound to troponin, the sites are open up, actin and myosin can make contact. Now we can see cross-bridge cycling, okay? As a result, now we can see the shortening of the sarcomere, and now we can see force generation. So as that sarcomere shortens and contracts, we see generation of force, right? Tension starts to go up, and then it's going to reach its peak. That is the maximum amount of tension that a muscle can produce. It's different for different sized muscles. So it can be anywhere from, let's say, 200 grams to 300 grams, et cetera, and it can take a different amount of time as well, again, depending on the size of that muscle. So it can be anywhere from 10 milliseconds to all the way up to 100 milliseconds for some of our bigger, bulkier muscle groups. But this is the time that we start to see force from the beginning of that force generation right up to the peak of the contraction, or the maximum force that can be generated for that muscle. The third and final phase is the relaxation phase. This is the longest phase, as you can see here visually on the graph. This is where we have decreasing back to zero. So the muscle begins to relax here. This is longer than it takes for the muscle to contract. And what's happening here biochemically is the calcium pumps that are on the SR are pumping that calcium from the sarcoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum where it's being stored. And again, that takes a little bit more time than it does for calcium to leave the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so the relaxation phase is where we're kind of winding down from that muscle contraction. As we see here, force generation is dropping right off slowly. And this is also the longest phase of muscle of the twitch. Okay, and I did go ahead and create this graph here. Actually, let me capture it now. It will be with the recordings today, just in case you want to recreate this or you missed anything or want to fill in any details. All right. And again, it's just reiterating those three phases of our twitch: the latent period, zero tension, zero force, excitation, contraction, coupling here. In other words, the warming up of that machinery. Then we get the contraction phase. This is where we have cross-bridge cycling. Tension begins to rise here all the way up to the peak of our contraction. Then we have the relaxation phase, the longest phase. Tension slowly drops off and the calcium pumps are removing that calcium. And remember, when we remove that calcium from the sarcoplasm, the troponin now does not have calcium bound to it. And so the tropomyosin is going to recover those binding sites. And so now we won't be able to have the interaction between actin and myosin. In other words, we won't be able to have shortening of the sarcomere. And so it's going to be more of a passive recoil for that muscle to relax. Okay, that's also why it takes a bit longer. I also want to point out that this is all in response to a single action potential known on muscle as an end plate potential. So in response to a single action potential here on muscle, we have these three events, which is a single twitch. Now, there are different types of twitches. So twitches are not all made equal. There are different types of twitches depending on whether or not they can manipulate a load or not. And in speaking about the different types of twitches, we want to talk about some terminology here. So we want to think about the different parts of the muscle. So there are the contractile elements. The contractile elements are the parts of the muscle that are actively shortening. We talked about this as being the sarcomeres, but the sarcomeres make up the myofibrils. The myofibrils make up the muscle fiber. The muscle fiber makes up the muscle itself, right? The fascicles and so on that make up the entire muscle body. And so these are the contractile parts, the parts of the muscle that are actually actively shortening. We then have the series elastic elements, or the SEC. The series elastic elements are the non-contractile bits, okay? These are just connecting the contractile elements to the bone, right? This is the connective tissue that's around the muscle. This is the tendon that's actually connecting from the muscle body to the bone. And these parts of the muscle just kind of move with the movement of the muscle. So they don't contract or expand or relax themselves, but they just move depending on the contraction or shortening of the contractile elements, which are the muscle itself. We also want to talk about what tension is. So tension is the force that's exerted by a muscle that is contracting. And a really good way to actually, I am going to insert myself here. Okay. I'm just going to be doing some visual actions, and I want the folks who are watching the recording to be able to appreciate that. Okay, so the muscle is contracting and it's going to be generating some force, and that force can be used to move a load, right? That is called a tension, the amount of force that's produced by a contracting muscle to overcome a load. And then just to describe a load here a bit further, this is the force that is opposing contraction. A really good example of a load is the weight that we're trying to move. So let's say I'm trying to lift this water bottle. My muscles have to contract to provide the tension that's required, but the load would be considered the bottle, right? And so when my muscle shortens, it's going to be pulling all these series elastic elements, which are the tendons that are attached to my bones, and that's what's going to provide the shortening, but the tension is required to overcome this load. So you got the tension my muscles producing, and then the load is the opposing force that is being provided by this object, okay? And so just to describe some of those terms and kind of introduce them so that we can better understand the difference between an isometric and an isotonic twitch.